Welcome to Altus Insights podcast series with Ray and Marlon, hosted by me, Avi. This podcast will cover monthly market updates and construction cost impacts across major markets in Canada.
So welcome back. This is part 2 of the scheduling delays podcast. Obviously, last week, or the last recording, Ray and Duan were a little doom and gloom on things, but Duan towards the end was warming up towards some solutions that we might look at. And I thought it was interesting in some of the last comments about change management and whatnot. And in essence, you were touching on the fact that part of the solution is being more proactive than reactive, and that the fundamental challenge in the construction industry as we face now, I would say the development industry, is a lot of people tend to look about what's happened in the past rather than proactively looking at what can happen in the future. And you were touching on the problems with change orders and how they could lead to significant schedule delays. I would also add maybe even the buyout process often doesn't focus on schedule and constructability. So what's the sort of solutions around that, Duan, you see in that buyout process, in that change management, that you can really a developer can make their life easier now for 2 years out?
So, I mean, there's various things that you can do. And I think that unfortunately scheduling very often isn't given enough attention, and it isn't used as a tool to manage or monitor or control a project. So certainly, as you mentioned, the proactive element of it is very important. So, if you have the expertise to evaluate a construction schedule for constructibility, have you evaluated all the risks? I mean, there are various ways that you can evaluate, the different streams of work. You can sort of test the schedule to see, if we do anticipate, some delays in the permitting, or a potential slower than usual winter work period, when we are doing activities outside, various different things, or if we know that there is an issue in the market with formwork or with drywall, and these are just common trades that I'm picking out that I know have had issues. There are ways to test the schedules. If we lose 20 to 30% productivity, what does your schedule look like? And what does it look like for other trades? Because one trade can have an impact across various streams of work. So I would say the proactiveness in really understanding your schedule and really putting it to the test, to doing like a fidelity check to make sure that the schedule operates in the right way if things move. The biggest challenge is you'll find a lot of these schedules have missing logic or haven't quite been built to model situations where you have issues in a particular trade that cascades throughout your project. So you're never really getting a true reflection of your completion date. I would say from a developer perspective, you're even looking at the schedule at a much higher level. So you have a tower development, so let's say a residential tower with 70 odd floors, but you're only seeing at a high level your envelope finishes and PDIs all lumped into one activity. There's no way for you to really understand if that duration is accurate or not, unless if you're able to figure out how much time you actually need for each trade in order to complete a floor, in a certain period of time. So I think it's really important to understand what is being put in front of you, because although it's a contractor schedule, it might not be achievable. And it as well as getting delays from like owner changes and things like that. A lot of the time, contractors just fail to schedule properly, and that also creates delays, and that also creates issues with the reliability of your schedule. So I would definitely say being proactive, reviewing that schedule, really understanding it and putting it to the test is important. But then also once you've got an understanding and you've set your baseline schedule and everything's hunky-dory, it's very important to actually stay on top of it, to really understand if the work is being executed in accordance with that schedule. And and to get an understanding of where things are heading. So if you are seeing schedule slippage, rather than waiting until the project is almost beyond, beyond saving, that you need to get a claims expert in to fix things or find out what's going on. It's very simple. If you have scheduling resources that could look at the performance of your work, figure out, if there is a weak link, so if there's a trade that's underperforming, what that looks like for the entire project, so that you can use that opportunity to try and, remedy the issues that you're facing. So, as with any project, the longer you wait to remedy or even identify a problem that happens on your project, the opportunity to mitigate disappears exponentially. So, the closer you get to completion, the more unlikely you are to correct or remedy your delays. So, being proactive is key. Catching issues from onset or at the early stages of construction is key. And certainly understand your construction contract. You'll be amazed that there are various contractual avenues to remedy issues that you face on your project, especially from a scheduling perspective. Whether it's issuing notices and things like that, and it often just doesn't happen. People tend to be optimistic and listen to what they're being told and what the schedule is showing them. But more often than not, the schedule, because it is flawed and it wasn't reviewed appropriately or enough, the schedule is only telling you what the schedule wants to tell you, but it's not actually showing you what the real doom and gloom date is at the end of the project. And that's why when you get to, your finishes on the higher levels of a tower, you tend to see slippage of, 1 week to 2 weeks every month, because your schedule is starting to realize that it no longer can tell you a lie, and everything starts to push out to where it eventually will be. So, yeah, I think that's the single best advice I could probably give anyone, is really understand your schedule, really understand whether it is actually constructible. And if you're not able to scrutinize it, find somebody who understands boots on the ground, how they would build it from start to finish. And that should give you some level of confidence on whether or not your schedule is achievable, or, whether it makes sense. I think it's probably the best place to start.
Isn't it often, it's often quality over quantity, and the problem I often see is clients work on the quantity basis. They go, there's 3,000 lines in the schedule, it must be right. And then you're looking, you're going, well, it's a heritage facade, there's really iffy shoring, and you've got to try and form up through that building, and you've got 4 lines for the heritage facade and shoring combined, and then 3,000 lines for the rest of the building. Is that an indication that that's the bit the person who did the schedule really understood, or is that just an underappreciation of them really focusing on what is critical, which is if you lose a year up front, you can never gain that back?
And I would say that in many instances, schedulers have a tendency to overcomplicate schedules. I mean, it's like anything. So the more detail you give somebody, the more it proves that you understand the work and that you're good at what you do. I actually believe a schedule does not need to be very, very detailed necessarily, unless if you are working on a project that allows you to track and progress and monitor work at that level. So, if you have a very complex processing facility that needs various things in place before you can do, certain activities, or you have shutdown windows and things like that, you might be looking at a more detailed schedule. Because it's required. It's very time critical, and it's almost like a checkbox that we need to do these things in a short period of time. And that might make sense. But most of the time, a schedule can be simplified in a higher level of activity. So you can look at either a level 4 or level 3 schedule that should be sufficient for the purposes of tracking and monitoring your project, as a developer. having a 3,000 activity schedule provides you no benefit because most of the time the resources allocated to update and maintain these very complex schedules just don't have the time to do it, and it's either done poorly or it's not done at all. And then at the end of the day, you have a garbage in, garbage out situation. And where do you go from there? You already established a very complex schedule. It's very difficult to go from that to sort of claw back and oversimplify it again. So, but having said that, some projects need more detail, some don't. But you have to choose the level of detail that makes sense for the purposes of that schedule. I mean, if you are a developer or an owner, you don't really need to see, every single activity in a 5,000 activity schedule. You only care about are the main scopes of work or the main areas, or maybe room by room. Does that satisfy, your sort of tracking and monitoring of the work, so that you have confidence in when you can take delivery of your project? Other than that, there's no need to scrutinize any further.
Yeah, and then the only thing I wanted to touch on is on the first part that we very gently touched on renovation. So Ray, I know we've left you quiet for a little bit, but you've spoken before about raising the roof on industrial, and I know in Calgary there's a lot of discussion on office conversion to residential. Ray, do you see that side continuing then? Duan, I just wanted to have you touch on first principle approaches for some unique projects, maybe the difference in approach. So Ray, if you want to touch on some background to what's happening, and then Duan can touch on the actual solutions.
Yeah, and Marlon, I feel that over the last few podcasts, I'm starting to channel you a little bit more. It's all about the performance. It's all about the cash flow. So when you look at raising the roof on industrial, that it was a lot more sort of perhaps common a number of years ago to increase the height of the industrial building to allow for more storage and more stacking. But when you look at the cost and labor increases over the last little while, it's not as feasible, especially when you're looking at costs on a per square foot basis, north of about $325 a square foot. Financially, it doesn't make any sense anymore. So you're better off looking at alternative sort of older buildings, or if you want to locate in sort of outside of the metropolitan area as alternatives. And from a convergence standpoint, it's the same thing, especially with the older buildings, that actually it may cost more based on the space configurations that you need, and as well as how you need to bring in certain services within the building. And more often than not, you're probably better off just tearing down the building and starting from scratch to get the proper layouts that you may need, especially if you're converting anything from like office to residential. That's why we haven't really seen that big swing, even though that we have, like, with respect to Calgary, high office vacancy rates, that it has to make financial sense. So I'm not really sure if that's going to change anytime soon, but we are seeing sort of, especially with the increase in resource prices over the last month or so, that Alberta's looking better and better from a financial and economic standpoint. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the continued movement with the costs, and as well as whether or not the rents can keep up with the escalations, and whether or not we hit some sort of economic recession, and what that does to the expectation on pricing.
Yeah, so I think me and Ray both agree conversions and major rentals and whatnot tend to be very complicated. They're extremely expensive. I'm not sure I have to classify it as crazy to go ahead with it. But Duan, on your side, when you're doing a schedule and a client's looking at scheduling that, I find on the rental side, people are even more optimistic sometimes on the greenfield side. Is that something you see? And then the solution to how you deal with these one-off, because each conversion is unique. It's not like any two are the same.
So, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think people are a lot more optimistic, a lot more aggressive, because they believe that the structure is there. They always believe that, they're going to go in there, it's going to be like a blank canvas on the inside. But in reality, it's not uncommon. As soon as that first, partition wall goes down and they realize, that there's some services they can't relocate, or, especially on projects where there's limited to no as-built records. So that's when you start seeing like the site conditions, change orders coming in, and then your schedule slips like for this issue, and then it slips for that issue. And all of them, actually all of the projects that we've seen, there was just this level of optimism where it was, a lot more aggressive than building a new build. But I almost feel as if it's more complex. So you are dealing with existing an existing structure with a lot of secrets behind the walls and above the ceiling. And until you've done, and I know that some of these projects, there are some degree of investigations that take place before the work is even awarded to a contractor to provide a schedule. But I don't think enough emphasis is placed on the fact that there are so many unknowns that you can't really schedule aggressively. You actually have to have a caveat with every single activity. So, I mean, we have seen recently on a project in Toronto, it was a science building conversion or was a sports or a multi-purpose hall that went into, laboratories. But I think the schedule overrun by 3 times the amount because there was no assumptions put on any of the duration. So yes, there was a site study done and theoretically, if everything was as they thought, they probably could have done the work in the same amount of time. But there were no assumptions provided. So their durations were assumed that they will not run into any issues. But I think that's flawed. You have to always think, okay, so there is likely some mechanical equipment or something behind here that needs to be relocated. So let's say if it isn't there, it's a 3-month duration. If we have to relocate it, it's a 6-month duration. And if you actually build these scenarios into your schedule, and again, this is how you do schedule risk analysis on any project. So if you look at the optimistic assumption and what the duration looks like for that, and then you look at the worst case scenario, like you're going to find all the issues while you're working on this activity. What is the longest possible duration it's going to take? And normally it's fall somewhere in the middle. So if you at least understand what your worst case is, then you can give a owner or a developer or somebody a worst case scenario that if everything falls apart or we run into all the issues that we've anticipated, this is your new completion date. And I think that's on a building where there's so many unknowns. That's probably the best place to start, where you are under-promising with the hopes of over-delivering.
Yep.
So, and I think in those instances, you might start seeing projects that deliver ahead of schedule because you weren't optimistic at the beginning. Because I know in the ideal world, nobody wants to approach an owner and say, well, we think it's going to take 3 times as long as what the next person is going to tell you. But I think if you can put down sound assumptions on why you're saying it will never be completed in this very optimistic duration, I think people might be open to that if you can demonstrate to them that, it's very optimistic.
Well, I think the private sector's always built a little bit on optimism because that's the only way we'd ever get anything built. There has to be a little bit of risk taking. But I think we all agree that the renovation conversion projects, I mean, if I was a developer, I wouldn't be sleeping very well till they're finished.
Yeah.
I don't remember the last renovation project that did not go over budget or over schedule. And it's on the private side, that's difficult. On the public side, hey, they just keep printing money, so they don't seem to care. So we're not going to fix that side of it. They just need a reason they can explain why they went over budget. No, we'll call it escalation. We'll call it, it rained on Tuesday, therefore we lost 4 months, that sort of stuff.
and that's exactly after being after the fact. So, if they were a little pessimistic and they built in some risk in terms of, additional time and potentially additional costs that they might incur, it wouldn't be such a big surprise after the fact.
Yeah, and I think part of the challenge now is we're getting a lot of projects that are not necessarily renovation, but with the heritage component. The fact that anyone sneezes near a building remotely famous in Toronto, they designate it as famous, as heritage. Basically, the ugliest buildings are now getting designated as heritage. I would have thought most people in the neighborhood would actually like it torn down, but I suppose that's what happens when you're in this city. But I think that's the challenge now on the private side is we're getting into that quasi space now where there's a little bit of renovation, a little bit of new, and that's when it gets really complicated because those two worlds come together now at the same time.
Well, and exactly that. So you also have a building that probably doesn't perform very well in terms of what's required from an environmental standpoint to heat and light, and to incorporate that in a old brick facade that used to be some kind of a factory in Toronto. That there are a lot of challenges with that because you're trying to preserve that facade, but meanwhile you're trying to build something beautiful and modern on the inside. It certainly comes with a lot of challenges. But if there was a way that you could potentially knock it all down, if it's not that important, and just rebuild it, you're probably a lot better off. If you were able to let's say, preserve that facade by not using the original facade, but rebuilding it in exactly the same spec and aesthetic, you might actually end up with a much nicer building. I think, obviously for me, buildings like stonework that you can't really recreate because it's weathered with time and all of that, that might be a different story. But I am seeing in Toronto, like the preservation of these old brick factories that I don't know. I don't think that they are aging the best, but they certainly give people a big challenge, preserving those and trying to make something beautiful out of them on the inside.
Yeah, heritage consultants tend not to like cost consultants. We're oversimplistic in our view on what is actually valuable. Hence the fact we need heritage experts because we just tear it all down. So it's a good thing. Yeah, I think the challenge is it used to be you could remove a facade, take it down piece by piece, label each brick, put it in a warehouse, bring it back. That was from a schedule and a construction point of view was much more, I wouldn't say simplistic, but a lot more reasonable to try and anticipate.
A lot less unknowns.
Yeah, the challenge we have now is the City of Toronto is worried that someone's either going to steal that building while it's in a warehouse or the developer might lose the 6-story building somewhere. So they like you to keep it in place and cause mass havoc with traffic and productivity instead. So one of the things that was been discussed in the sort of the prep side for this was something about a 360 video diary. And I just wanted to touch on that before we then talk on some of what happens once we have these development delays. So we'll do the solutions, then we'll do a quick thing with Ray yourself on the impacts. But there was mention of a 360 video diary. What is that? I actually have no idea either.
So it's actually a very cost-effective tool that gives owners and developers and anybody, any project stakeholder, the ability to document progress on site in time intervals. So it's very it's actually quite simple technology. It's a relatively affordable 360 camera that you mount to your helmet. The software is basically or you upload your floor plan, so you get the site layout, and then you do tell like the software where you're starting your capture, and it sort of builds together a visual 3D model as you walk through the building. So you could do a visual or a virtual walk through the site at any given time that you have taken or I've done a capture of the site, as they call it. So in my mind, that is the best record of progress that you could have in your pocket. So not only can you allow people to visit your site virtually, so you don't need to arrange for people to come to your site, do safety inductions, all of that. You can take them to the location. They can look in all areas. I mean, it's not actually 360 degrees. It's a sphere. So you can look down, you can look up, and you can see everything that's going on site. And what what we're using it for is actually claims defense. So the owners normally have or are the underdog, if you want, in a claim situation, because they don't have the site records that a contractor have. They haven't been on site daily, so they can't necessarily produce the evidence to defend themselves against these claims. So more often than not, it's, if it's fair and reasonable, we'll pay the money because we can't say otherwise. But with this site diary that you have in time intervals, you can walk in the areas on site that, that has been subject to a claim or a delay, and you can walk through that same area across time to see what actually happened. And you might see that there might have been material stored in that area by another trade, and therefore work didn't progress. And you can start, and even if the claim is legitimate, you could very easily prove that it's fine, that yes, the owner might have caused some kind of a disruption on the project. And you can issue, the amount owed, and there's no further argument. So you're potentially eliminating very expensive litigation fees. And also, I think it's just the element of dealing with, but we are now working more remote than ever. So, I am seeing clients that or owner organizations that have their staff distributed across various different geographic areas. But now with this technology, they're able to bring expertise on different sides of the organization to visit their site without actually having to fly them there or spend a lot of time in the car, just to look at an issue and come up with a solution. And I think we're going to see more and more of this technology because it is becoming completely flawless. It's so easy to use. The technology is fairly simple. It's just a camera on a hard hat. And I think it's only a matter of time until, we find a way. I think at the moment, using things like drones to perhaps do that for you might not be the safest thing, especially with materials and people moving around on site. So we definitely need a human element of that right now. But I think that it is a very good record for an owner to have. And even if it doesn't get used in a claims defense situation, you have an as-built record of all of the rough-ins and services that are behind your wall. You no longer have to tear up a drywall or partition wall to see what's behind there. You can just flip back on that same wall, on the calendar when the captures happen, and you can see where the conduits are put in place. You can see where gas pipes or water pipes are, what the services and the ceilings look like. And the more interesting thing is it actually integrates to BIM. So if you have a BIM model on your project, it can tie into or semi-automatically updating progress. So it can recognize various components in BIM that has progressed. And you can also use that for 4D scheduling to update your schedule. So you really have a holistic sort of plan in your BIM model of how theoretically you should have built it in what amount of time versus when it was actually built. But you can visually see as the work progresses. And it's very interesting stuff. And I think I could probably talk about that for many hours on end and definitely show a demonstration. But it is very interesting technology. And I think it is cost effective. And I don't see a reason why an owner or a developer wouldn't have that on all of their projects.
Yeah, so I think the conclusion that most of the solutions is you need to be very, very proactive. You need a solutions-based consultant, and people need to move away from this rear view mirror looking and trying to fight things. And I know on changes, because my team do quite a lot of change review and whatnot, trying to fight something 2 years after it's happened, like smashing your head against the wall, get records. So more proactive, the better. So what we'll do is we'll just finish off quickly, just because this whole session's been way too positive, the second one. Let's talk about what happens when these schedules go wrong, because there is a development issue. Like what happens on an industrial and office project, Ray, when these things get delayed and you're trying to get a tenant in and the tenant can't move in or you can't finish on time?
Well, the challenge, and it's interesting that you bring up with industrial, because in Toronto alone, the industrial availability rate is at 1.2%. So it's very difficult for them to have that flexibility. Oh, can I stay in this space for an additional 3 to 6 months, right? And that has to be managed accordingly. So I think there's certain. It sort of helps a little bit if you're in existing owner building and you're moving into a new one that they're building, and you can range it. The challenge is that when you're going from a sale of a building into a newer building, and that building's not complete yet. So the whole aspect is communication, and especially with the delay with materials. And industrial is known for the whole some of the logistical challenges, so they shouldn't be surprised about it. But I think it's a bit of a concern. And same thing with some of the plans with the other commercial products in retail and office. There's a certain expectation in being able to either have a fresh start after the pandemic with new space, and those type of delays are also costing in a way of the relocation costs and other sort of plans. So it really cascades when you have a scheduling issue with a new project or a renovation, or even the improvement of the space is really impacting strategy. So what we're starting to see is some of that impact. And again, what we said earlier with that need to be in sort of that more suitable space with the pandemic, allowing for other amenities and so on and so forth, that causes some of those challenges that is starting to sort of stack up, and is more concerned with a market such as industrial, where you don't have the flexibility. You can't move into another building for 6 to 9 months, especially based on the size and based on requirements. So when we're seeing these type of delays, it really has an impact on the market on both the tenant side and the owner side.
Yeah, and on the residential side, it leads to cancellations. It's the biggest cause of cancellations, especially on the approval side. For anyone that's seen my market presentations, I touch on that in a lot more detail, how municipal approvals have led to delays in projects and ultimately caused cancellations, and are the most likely cause of a cancellation is around schedule delays. And it kind of touches then to the point, if all these asset types are impacted, I find as a closing remark, schedule isn't dealt with the same level as I would say cost is. People tend to be obsessed more with the cost than they are the schedule, when if you look at it, they are equal risks, if not time actually being the bigger risk, because time will ultimately may end up with your project cancelled, may end up with you bankrupt, may end up with the trade no longer functioning. Cost is just part of that journey that ties into time. And I find, to Duane's point in the last session, a lot of people are not spending enough time actually really looking at the quality of the schedule. They're obsessed with the quantity of line items, and it's how good the schedule is, not necessarily how many line items you have on it. And one of the funny anecdotes we'll just put on this as we're at the end is, this is actually the third time we've rescheduled this, because Duan hasn't been able to make it to the other three due to scheduling issues. So I don't know if that's a good sign or a bad sign. And Duan is actually in a coffee shop right now because he miscalculated how long it was going to be to get home. So he's doing well. I know you were stuck down in San Antonio. Was it last week? You went to the event.
Scheduling issues. Air Canada cancelled all of their routes to Dallas at that time, and we were just left high and dry. So I think in that situation, there was no way for us to actually anticipate a complete cancellation. But as you said, delays lead to cancellation. So it makes complete sense, even in airlines.
You got to see part of Texas, so you got a little bit of a tour out of it. Anyway, Ray's traveled halfway across America this year playing golf or presentations. I'm not sure which one it was he was doing, but so I think on that note, we can probably end, and it's all about being proactive. So thank you, Duan, for joining us today. I think it's been a great couple of sessions. Thank you as always, Ray. I think the next episode, we're going to be talking about inclusionary zoning, which should be a very fun subject. So thank you very much. Everyone have a great day. And that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.